All right, so does everybody have their Torah portion notes? Did everybody grab your new ones? They're in the back. Today was the last week of the first section for Genesis. And the next Torah portion back there is for Exodus and Leviticus for 12 weeks. It is the new one for next week. So if you have your old ones, wrap up this week. Hopefully you brought your questions, right? That's the whole idea. You read through your stuff. You wrote down questions. You're going to bring them to today. And as we were looking at the topic, you saw overcoming failure. And so you all thought, okay, Matt's going to give us 7 ways to overcome failure, right? Or you just look up Google overcoming failure, and there's a million different things on there to talk about overcoming failure. And so as I was looking at this, I kind of, to be honest with you, I kind of moved away from just that idea because it was too easy. It's too easy to just look at anybody can look at Google and say, what are the 7 steps for overcoming failure? I mean, it was everywhere. And to be honest with you, as I opened this up, it wasn't even like I was feeling like I should have gone that direction. So it was a confirmation. But I wanted to start with Genesis 43, right in the middle of your reading. Verse 26. Aaron, can you read Genesis 43:26 for us, please?
When Joseph came home, they brought into the house to him the present that they had with them and bowed down to him to the ground.
Excellent. Do you have my notes back there to where the slides are?
No. Just blind.
Click. There we go. All right. So I guess what I'll just keep an eye on me. So when I raise my hand, you'll know. Yeah, I thought I gave this to you. And I couldn't find them back there, so I thought you'd have them. My bad. So the passage that we have started out here is something that this story that's been leading up to this. And just the idea of if you've been reading through the Jacob story, you come to the conclusion like, wait a sec, okay, this is part of the dreams and part of the things that Joseph had been looking at and pondering in his youth and wondering. And part of the things that got him in trouble in his youth, by saying and talking about these dreams. And as we end this passage, or not this passage, but these few chapters, 43 through 45, it's the end of your Torah portion book, and you're going to move to from Genesis to Exodus, but it's not the end of this story. This is a small story that is a much larger story that we're going to be continuing for the next several months. And as I looked at that, I want to just begin tonight's conversation and topic about this idea of how we look at the Bible. And when we read the Bible, what is it that we look at? Right? There's many different ways to read the Bible. You can read the Bible as though it's theology, and you can look for theological points and proofs and discussions about God and all of this stuff. You can read the Bible as history. It's just a bunch of historical things that took place and happened, and that's true as well. You can read the scriptures as though they're story. There's an element of story, and when you tell a story and how you understand and how you hear a story, what you learn from a story. There's poetry throughout the Bible, and we've shown that several places in Genesis. There's multiple times where there's this poetic rhythm that is trying to teach a point as well. So there's poetry. There's law, like we're going to be getting into in the next few months as well. Lots of law. And then there's just this idea of instructions, right? And so there's lots of different ways for lots of people to read the Bible one way, or we can read the Bible in all of those ways, right? And understand that is how the Torah is written, especially when it comes to Genesis. Genesis has a way of doing an interesting job of focusing on themes, right? And as I was reading one theologian, or I'm the scholar, I guess it would be a scholar, who talked about in Genesis particularly, there's these, what he calls type scenes. There's these events that take place that they seem to happen again and again and again, that the audience that you're reading, you recognize, you see these things, and like, this is a pattern here. There's similarities in these stories, in these type scenes, right? And so when we look at things like sibling rivalries, right? Do we ever see any sibling rivalries in Genesis? Several, right? Yeah, there's several of them. Right? There's Click, there's Cain and Abel, There's Ishmael and Isaac. We have Esau and Jacob, and then we have Joseph and his brothers, right? So there's several of these sibling rivalries. We also see that there's the patriarchs. They have this issue with famines, right? And they have these times where they have to leave and pick up and go because of famines. And then we also have this interesting thing where there's three different stories where these people in the Bible, they find their wives at a well. Right? There's these patterns that take place, and these stories, these scenes that take place. And as we get to our story here in Genesis, we come upon another type scene, and it's the type scene of clothing, right? And so this story begins with Jacob. This is a part of another scene, and if you'll remember it, right, where when it comes to clothing, we remember Jacob wearing Esau's clothes, right? We remember Joseph had a coat that was brought back to his father that was all bloody. We remember Tamar changed her clothes. We remember Joseph's robe was ripped off of him last week, right? And it was used against him in the case with Potiphar. And then last but not least, Joseph was dressed by Pharaoh as a high-ranking Egyptian. Right? So there's this theme of clothing that is all building together. And as I looked at this, the question that I was going through popped up was, what do all of these scenes have in common? What do all 5 of these scenes have in common? I think of it again. Right? We have Jacob wanting a blessing. What does he do? We have the brothers who bring home a bloody coat. We have Tamar who changes clothes. Deception. Right? All of these stories have a theme running through them. They were all about deception. Right? Jacob had to deceive his father for the blessing. The brothers brought home the bloody coat to deceive their father of what they had actually done. Tamar had to deceive Judah so that she could get an heir. Potiphar's wife, had to deceive her husband so she could get revenge. And Joseph hides the fact of who he is to his brothers just to make sure that they're not the same, to see if they've actually changed or not. And as I was going through this, one of the things that, we've been saying, and Aaron would probably remember this all the way back maybe at Crossroads, is this saying that we used to say all the time. People's perception is their reality. Right? People's perception is their reality. But as we look at this passage from Genesis 43, one of the things that stares out and is glaring from this type scene is that appearances can be deceiving. Right? Not everything is as though it seems by what we see. What's really interesting is how clothing is the lesson that teaches us about deception. Right? In fact, the next one, on the next slide, the Hebrew word that is in all of these stories, Genesis 38, 39, and 40, and 43, is that the garment, the word for garment, Hebrew word for garment, clothing, is beged, which is clothing, but as all Hebrew words, it also means deceit, treachery, betrayal. This is what the Hebrew word means. So this story of this type scene, these things all coming together, and the word that is being used in a theme through all of these things is beged, which is interesting to us because from an Eastern perspective, as you read this in Hebrew, you see these connections. But for our Western culture, and we read it in English, we pass right by it. And not only do we pass by it, but it's our culture that places so much emphasis in our Western culture on what we see. Right? What we see is extremely important. The outward appearance is what typically our Western culture looks at. That's how we make our judgments. We look at somebody, we see somebody, how they're dressed, how they're not dressed the way we think they should be, or maybe what they're doing, and we make judgments about people based on what they wear, their skin color, what they're doing, what they're driving, their job, right? We view and we judge based on what we see. And this isn't unnatural. This is the roots of our culture, the roots of our history from Western society. We look at, historically, the pagans, right? What did the pagans do, in Greek culture? Where's my kids in here? They're not, the younger kids, right? When they read, what are some of the younger books that oh, come on. Greek culture, Greek mythology.
Odysseus, Odyssey.
Yes, those are literature ones, but not that he's going to read. What are the ones that you read with the kid who was with the gods?
Percy
Percy Jackson, right? Percy Jackson, the famous story, right? Most kids this age have probably read all of the Percy Jackson books, right? And it's fascinating. You get to see and you learn about all the gods, right? And who they were. And this historically has been passed on for thousands of years, right? And we don't do it anymore. We read books about the gods, but the younger generations and adults thousands of years ago, they didn't read books about the gods. What did they do to learn about the gods? They would go to the temple. And who was in the temple? Who was in the Greek temples?
Priest.
Who else was in the Greek temples?
Goddesses. And the gods.
The gods and the goddesses, right? The gods and the goddesses. You would go to the temple of Zeus, right? And I think I have a picture of it up there, right? You go to the temple of Zeus. Next one. Why is he going backwards? Wrong way.
I'm only hitting one button. Same button the whole time.
There we go. Right? So you go to the temples, and you would go inside the temple and you would worship Zeus, because there's Zeus. Right? They would create a big giant statue of Zeus or Artemis. Right? If you were reading your Acts portion, 19, and maybe if you kept reading through 20 and so forth, there was this big riot in Ephesus. Right? And people were dragging people in, and Paul was wanting to go into the temple of Artemis. Right? And why were they doing this? You remember your Acts portion? Why were the people so upset in Ephesus over their god Artemis? There was a riot almost, and Artemis is great.
They're mad that people weren't buying idols.
The idols, right? The people who made the idols were losing sales, right? They weren't getting as much money, and so they were blaming who? This Paul guy, right? This Shaul, this Jewish guy who was turning people away from the images that people would buy of who their gods were. And they would take these images and they would place them in their houses or whatever, and they say, there's my God, I can see my God. Right? This is the roots of our culture. It's all about what we look at. Even Abraham, his father, what did his father do historically that we learned?
So he sold idols.
He was an idol maker.
Idol maker.
Right? So this goes way, way back. And as humans, we naturally tend to judge based on what we see. There's my God. I believe it to be true. Right? But the Bible has a different perspective on this. In fact, if you go to 1 Samuel 16, we'll read this one. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Up until this point, who was king? Saul, right? Saul was king, or Shaul in his Hebrew name, right? He was seen as a king because he was big in stature, right? He was strong. He had a presence about him. He had this ego that, like, he seemed like this man of power. He seemed like a king. He held himself with such, like, esteem. Like, everybody that saw him looked at him like, he must be the king. But there was a couple problems with this, is that this Saul guy, he lacked confidence. On the outside, he looked great. But on the inside, he wrestled, he struggled, he had serious issues. And as we learn from this and other passages, he lacked character. Right? What is character? Anybody heard any sentences before, anything that said this is what character is?
Who you are when no one's looking.
There you go. That's exactly what I have written down. A very popular phrase, right? Character is who you are when nobody is looking. And that's a great statement. And I think it's the beginning point of what character is. Because character is not what you see, it's what's inside you. Right? Like we see it here. Right? It's not the outward appearance that defines character. It's kind of like the Gatorade commercial, right? Is it in you? Right? There's this idea that the character is what comes out. It's not necessarily what you always see. Maybe this is why, going back to the original topic, maybe this is why so many people struggle with failure. We are so concerned about what people think, or what they might think when they see what we've done or what's happened, right? We're so concerned about, somebody looking at me and saying, well, look what he did. Or maybe it's not what he did, maybe it's what he didn't do, right? We live in this world by people are constantly looking to judge you by what you have done and what you haven't done. And maybe it's not just what you haven't done, but maybe it's the consequences of what you've done as well. Right? We have this fear of these things, which on one hand is a healthy thing, but not always. Too often there's so many people that are just plain afraid to try something because they might fail. They're afraid to step out of their comfort zone because if I do, what if I don't succeed? What if I break this? Or what if I am trying to do something and it doesn't work out? What if I try a new job? Or what if I start a business? Or what if, I start to try to date this person and it just doesn't work out? Should I get married? What if we fail? Maybe we shouldn't get married. Right? We live in a culture that is so concerned about failure that it holds so many people back today. Right? But it's not the failure that, in my opinion, is the worst part. It's what we do with the failure that defines us. And this is the next side. Do we learn from it? Do we learn from our mistakes? Are we willing to change if we have made a mistake? Too often, we never learn anything because we don't even risk anything. Right? If we talked about a few weeks ago, we talked about the parable of the talents. Right? Who was the people that God rewarded? The person who played everything safe, or the people who took a risk? Yeah. And somebody asked me after that sermon, they said, well, maybe if you would have looked at it differently, like what would have happened if, the people who took a risk, they failed? Like that could have been a story too, but it wasn't the story. And I think too often, and we live in a world where, we're so afraid to swing the pendulum to the risk side. We're like, we can't take too many risks. But have we ever gotten to the point where we've swung the pendulum the other side, where we live in a culture where everybody takes too many risks? We're like, everybody in this room is taking a risk. And we got to tell everybody, hey, stop taking risks, everybody. It's too dangerous. I don't remember a time in history where that's ever been a problem. It's always been the other way, where we've always trying to encourage people to take risks. Not, hey, stop taking risks, everybody. If we didn't take risks, would we have gone into space? Right? Would we have done all of the things that scientifically that have been achieved if we didn't take risks on things?
We didn't really go into space.
We never landed on the moon. You're right. Yeah, you're right. Sorry.
So are we gonna debate whether or not the outcomes were good or not? I mean, try to make a case that if we would have taken all these risks and done all this stuff, we could be living in a different world. Or like air.
More like where? Air?
Now, when I look at the Israelites and things that were going on, they're out in the desert. But they don't have to worry about anything. Really, all they have to do is just not screw it up. I mean, they got food, they got everything they needed. And now today, with all our advancements, everybody's stressed out. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if the outcome is worth.
Well, that's a different subject. That's good. Yeah, I don't want to get distracted there. But yeah, we could talk about that. But I think man is wired in a certain way that I would argue is progressive. Like it's to progress, right? We're constantly built to be learning, right? Otherwise, we'd still be Neanderthals, or we'd still be looking at fire and thinking, how do we start this fire again, right? We learn from these things and we grow. Right? And if we don't grow, and it's just like everything we've always taught here, if we don't grow, what happens? What are things? What? Yeah, you atrophy, you die, right? Yeah. And so I don't think that's how God wired us. God has wired us to always be growing. I mean, even if we just look at Genesis through Exodus, I mean, there was tremendous growth through there. They grew as a family, they grew in knowledge, they grew in their wisdom, they grew in possessions, they grew in family. I mean, all of this stuff happened, right? And I don't think we're ever supposed to necessarily go backwards. I think God has designed us to always be moving forward, right? But I do think that we make mistakes. And as I was looking at this, do we learn from these mistakes? Do we change? I think maybe the better question to ask would be, how do we change when we do these things? Because sometimes you can fail and you can change for the worse, can't you? You can look at something and I'm never going to try that again. I'm just moving away from that. And as I looked at this, I was struck with, in my research, this idea that there was two types of failure. There's moral failure, and then there's performance failure. And as I continued to research this, I recognized that both of these are actually still connected to character, who we are, right? The performance, what I do and what I don't do, and morally is all built on the same muscle of character. And character is something that, as you just said a minute ago, has to be strengthened, right? Because if you don't strengthen a muscle, what does it do? It atrophies. It goes away. Character is the same thing. We can build character within ourselves, or we can ignore it. And if we ignore character, then we allow these things like moral failure and performance failure to occur. So how do we begin this journey of building character? Right? How do we go through this and make sure that this continues to grow? And one of the things I was looking at was that we have to, as we talk about everything, we have to go back to the beginning, don't we? I mean, everything we've said always seems to go back to who?
God, Adam.
In the story. Adam and Eve, right? It always seems to go back to the story of Adam and Eve. It is all about God, yes, but the story-wise, yes,
God.
yes.
One time the answer isn't God.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. There you go.
But that's the answer I'm going to give, huh?
Right, hey, Chris, if it wasn't for God, Adam and Eve wouldn't be here, right? You're right.
But in Adam and Eve's story, right? In the Adam and Eve story, we also have a similar type scene, right?
Adam and Eve took the
Fails.
risk.
Well, they took risks, yes, but what was the type scene that we're talking about today? Clothes.
Yeah.
Is that something that they had as well? Yes, there was a clothes issue.
Deceit.
They had none, and then they had some, right? There was an issue with clothing, right? They were ashamed, and so they clothed themselves. And the question is, what did they do to become ashamed? What did they do to sin?
Made a mistake.
Well, that is sin. That is the word for sin, chata. You're right. But what was their chata? Was it sex?
No, it's soft.
Was it eating the fruit? What was it?
Disobeying God.
Disobeying
Disobeying.
God.
Not listening to God's order.
Right. It was not about what they saw. It was about, it had to do with what they saw was overriding what they heard. Right? God didn't, it's not that they saw God, it's that God spoke to Adam, and Adam spoke to Eve, right? And they heard this warning, they heard this message, they heard from God. And when we judge by appearance, a lot of times we miss the deeper truths about people and about situations. Can you relate to that? I mean, I think we all can relate to this idea of judgment. And that's when we do that, that's when we miss too often, we miss what God is trying to actually do in our life. We miss the fact that God, who isn't only heard, right? I'm sorry. That's when we miss God who is only heard. We're too busy looking at things. We're looking at these things to tell us or to guide us, but it's not the things that we're supposed to be looking for. It's the things that we're supposed to be listening for. I mean, think about it. What is the first thing, we've taught this for a long time, what is the first thing a Jewish family teaches a child to learn? What is the first thing they're taught this child at the earliest of ages to memorize and to recite?
Leviticus.
That is the teaching. But what is it that what did you say?
Shema.
The Shema, which is what? Hear. The very first thing that a young child at 2 or 3 years old, they teach them this prayer, and they teach them to recite it and to memorize it. The very first thing that a child learns is Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel. Not, Leviticus comes later, looking at how to do these things, but the first thing a child is taught is to listen. Appearances deceive. Clothing betrays sometimes. But deep understanding must move past what we see, and rather, we should have the ability to listen. And so, as I thought about this, there's a passage in Ephesians I want everybody to turn to. Ephesians chapter 4. We're going to stay a few minutes here. Actually, I have several passages I'm going to have you look up, so bear with me, because you're going to be turning to some pages. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 through 24. Who's there? And who wants to start?
4:17.
4:17 through 24. Go, Chris.
Now this I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, due to their hardness of heart. They have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. But that is not the way you learned Christ, assuming that you have heard about him and were taught in him, as the truth is in Jesus, to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt and deceitful desires, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness.
Good. No longer. You are to no longer walk as the Gentiles, which is interesting, right? And he's speaking to Gentiles. You're no longer supposed to walk in the way of the Gentiles, right? There was this way in which this culture lived. They would go to the pagan temples. They would go, and the images that they saw were a part of every aspect of their life. They had them in their temples, they had them in their homes, they had them in their banks, they had them in their grocery stores. In fact, a lot of these places like Ephesus, you couldn't even go to a grocery store without paying tribute to the gods before you could enter into. Imagine walking up to Winn-Dixie or Walmart and having to pray to an idol before you shopped and to give money to it. Would that be weird? That would be, it wouldn't be weird if that's how you grew up.
Right.
It would just be normal. Right? There's so many things in our culture that if you leave to another country, you guys have been to other countries before, you go down there like, man, why are you guys doing this? This is weird. Right? But they don't think it's weird. This is just how they live their life. And maybe we're the weird ones because we live differently. Right? Did you ever think about that? And so for these people, they grew up in this culture where everything was about the idols, everything was about the gods, and everything was about viewing these gods. And here's Paul saying, don't walk like that any longer. Remember, it's what you heard. It's the message that you heard about Messiah, this message about God. Don't live this way any longer. Slide down just a couple verses to chapter 5, verses 17. Aaron, 17 through 21, please.
Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ.
Right. One of the things that you would do in the temple, especially the temples of Bacchus. We know Bacchus, right? There's a big parade here. But Bacchus was one of the gods. You would go and you would get drunk in the temple of Bacchus. You would celebrate, and that's how you receive the blessings of the gods, by getting drunk. And Paul says, no, don't get drunk. This is an allusion to the pagan idols. Don't participate. Don't be like the Gentiles any longer. It's not necessarily this idea of, don't drink. Like, he wasn't talking about that. This is all in the context of paganism. But then he says what? What did he say right after that? Say that again.
Be filled with the Spirit.
But be filled with the Spirit. Next slide. Right? This is an interesting word because the word pleroo is a verb. Be filled, but it's a verb of continuous action. Too often we read this and like, be filled with the Spirit. And like it's like this one-time pouring, like, okay, Rustin, you're filled with the Spirit, go. But that's not what he's saying here. A better translation, which wouldn't make sense in English, would be being filled. Right? It's this idea of continually being filled. Because what happens when you drink that coffee cup? What happens to it? It's empty. right? It's no longer there. So what do you have to do with it?
Refill it.
You have to refill it, right? That's the idea. Paul is saying that we have to be filled. It's this verb of continually coming back to God, continually being filled over and over. It's not just this one-time thing, which is kind of what, I swear I changed that and I put it back. It's not James 2:12. It should say Philippians 2:12. Philippians 2:12 says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. You know, if Paul is this guy that's saying, hey, believe in Jesus and you're good, why is he telling us now to work out your salvation? Why is he telling us to be being filled? Why is it this constant thing? Right? Have you ever worked out before? You know, with fear and trembling, and you've worked out, you've pushed your muscles so hard that after you're done pushing, you know, your muscles are shaking and trembling. Right? There's this idea that you have to actually put energy into it. But when you do, what happens to your muscles? They grow. They get stronger. And when you stop working out, again, what happens? They atrophy. They get smaller. They die. Right? James 4:8 continues in this path. And all of these things have to do with hearing. If you go back to the context and read fully in these. But James says what? I wanted to read this. Because I read this again. So I'm going to back up. Bear with me. This is James 4:4. It says, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you suppose it is to no purpose that the scriptures say, he yearns jealously over the Spirit that he has made to dwell in us? He yearns jealously over the Spirit that he made to dwell in us. But he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw nearer to you. Draw nearer to God, and he will draw nearer to you. There's this idea that the Spirit moves. And to some degree, we play a part in that. As Paul says, it's our job to be filled with the Spirit. As James says, it's our job to draw near to God. Many times in my life, and maybe you can relate, I've asked this question where I felt alone. I felt distant. I've wondered, God, where are you? I don't hear you. I don't feel you. I can't see anything happening. Where are you? And I remember reading a passage of a book from Heschel, who quoted a rabbi. And the rabbi asked the same question to his audience. He was saying, where is God? And the rabbi answered back, wherever we let him in. Heschel says, God did not depart of his own volition. He was expelled. Yeah. It's not the idea that, God, where are you? Like, God's hiding somewhere. Too often, as I reflect back, it's not that God has gone anywhere, it's where I've gone. It's not that God has retreated from me, it's that I've pushed him away. God is always present. But too often we fail to let him in. And as I reflected back on this, in those times of my distance, I can see that it was me who moved away. It wasn't as though God was moving away from me. It was just me. There was a story I remember hearing about this rabbi, Jonathan Sachs, who was having this argument with one of the greatest scientists. I think he just died a couple of years ago. The mathematician guy, the English guy.
One in a wheelchair.
Yes.
Yeah.
What's his name? Stephen Hawking, right? They knew each other. And they had this debate. And obviously Stephen Hawking didn't believe in God. And here's a Jewish rabbi trying to talk to him about, on his level about God. And he was talking about this idea that there's a noise that's all around us, but deep inside of us is the music. And sometimes we have to block out the noise so that we can hear the music. And he was trying to talk about how the music is God that's inside of us. And Stephen Hawking wrote back to me and said, yes, I agree, there is a lot of noise, but there is no music. Right? So they had this banter back and forth, this idea, but it made me question even myself. Do I hear the music? Which was interesting because in Philippians, what did it say? Or to be being filled. And then what did it say after that? That we should spend time together in song, in psalms, and singing. There's this idea that there is a song inside of us. There's a music inside of us. And it shouldn't just be inside of us. It should come out with all of us together. And it's this song that unites us with God. It's this song that brings us together. But what holds us back from believing that? What holds Stephen Hawking back from believing that there is a God? And it goes to the question of, what's that?
Can't see it.
Can't see it. Right. Which is interesting, because if we turn to Hebrews chapter 1, right, we ask the question, what is faith? Right? What does Hebrews chapter 1 say?
What is that?
I'm sorry, Hebrews 11:1. Hebrews 11:1 through 3 says this, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the convictions of things, what?
Not seen.
Not seen. For by it people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. I'm going to write those down. I would like you to read Psalm 46 and John 3. And in John 3, Yeshua talks about the idea of the Spirit that blows. And the wind blows. And he says the Spirit blows where it wishes. And I remember I was actually talking to Russ, and in our conversation it made me remember a saying from an old evangelistic preacher who said, we can't see the wind. We can only see the effects of the wind. And it made me think about this idea of what is faith. And what is this idea of hearing God? What holds me back? What holds us back? What holds our community back? What from this idea of believing that we can hear God? What holds us back from that? We can read the text. We can see people serving. But what holds us back from this faith of believing that I can hear the music inside me, that I can hear God giving me direction, that I can hear God speaking? And it really came down to something that I've been studying for over a year now, and it's that idea that what we think about, we bring about. Henry Ford once said, for the man who thinks he can and the man who thinks he can't is both right. Psalm 23 says this, Yehovah is my shepherd. I do not lack. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He turns back my being. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. When I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You spread before me a table in the face of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup runs over. Only goodness and loving commitment follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of Yehovah to the length of days. Failure isn't new to us. There was plenty of successes and failure in those days. There was plenty of fear and danger in those days. Life has successes and failures. Life has joy and hardships. And what I learned is that it isn't so much about the actual ups and downs of our daily life as much as it is how we view those ups and downs. It's my perspective. My belief, my faith is what determines how I interpret those situations. If I believe those things to be something that God is teaching me, then I will learn from it. If I believe that I'm just unlucky, then I'll just be unlucky. If I believe that I'm just deemed to always fail, then guess what? I'll always fail. As the psalmist just wrote, I believe that you are my shepherd. And even though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, even though I walk through all of these problems every day, and there's wars being waged, there's people that are against me, there's these spies that are trying to kill me, there's all of these things happening around me, I believe that you are with me. When we stop pursuing the wonder and the awe of God, when we stop and we just get to a point where we're like, gosh, I don't know where God is. God's clearly not here. I mean, God, I don't know. Maybe God doesn't even speak. Maybe people just make that up. Maybe this is why Paul said, no, you are to be being filled. Because it's so easy to believe the opposite.
In John chapter 20, right? Thomas, when Jesus appeared to his disciples, and then Thomas went to go see the disciples, and he says, if I don't see it for myself, if I don't put my hands in his holes, I'm not going to believe it. And then Jesus appeared to him, he just touched me, he says, stop unbelieving, And he said, but blessed are those, he goes, you believe because you're seeing,
right.
But blessed are those who have believed and have not seen.
Right.
Goes along the same thing we're talking about.
It's easy to be distracted by the noise. It's easy to be distracted by all the problems around us. But the question remains, can you hear the music? Is it inside you? And I think this begins with the reminder that a 5-year-old child learns. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Every day this prayer, from 5. In fact, the first thing that they learn at 5 years old is the Shema. And every Jew is taught, on your deathbed, before you die, what do? You recite the Shema. It is a part of their everyday fabric. You don't go to work, you don't leave your house until you remind yourself, who am I supposed to hear? We should be no different. As the old Rabbi Obi-Wan Kenobi said, you will find that many truths we cling to depend greatly on our point of view. What is our perspective? Do we long to hear the music? Do we work hard and diligently on our salvation? Are we digging daily to be being filled? What is it that you do? Because as I've learned about many things, and I have a calendar that I teach about all the time, if it's not scheduled, it doesn't get done. If you're on a workout plan and you don't schedule your time for workout, you'll never have time for it. If you don't plan out what meals you're going to eat, and you never go to the store to prepare them, guess what happens? You go to Wendy's, right? If you don't have a plan of saying, what are the things that I need to do, and I'm going to make sure that I do these things, you'll wonder, gosh, I spent the whole week and I didn't even read once. You'll show up, where's your... You'll show up with your book stuck in your Bible, and you'll pull it out. You're like, oh, Matt's going to teach on Exodus today. I'm like, oh, I didn't even read. I didn't even take any notes. Shoot, I'm not going to ask any questions today because I didn't even, right? How often, when you open this up, do you actually not just read, but do you pray first and say, God, reveal to me something new today? I want to know something. How often do you just like sit? You know, there's the ancient mystics used to say this idea of being pickled in Jesus, right? What is a pickle?
Cucumber.
That's done what?
And pickle.
He's been baptized.
And that's the word that baptize is also in, I think it's Latin or Greek, is the idea of, it's whatever pickling is, there's a word for it, but it's pickled, right? To be baptized into something is to sit in it. And it gives it flavor, and it changes the cucumber into a pickle. Right? It's a weird thing. I didn't think I was going to talk about it. What?
You never made pickles before, have you?
I have made pickles.
So
Yeah.
what do you have to do?
You take a cucumber and I just take the pickle juice from another place that was really good, and I poured it in a can, and then I put the cucumbers in there, right? And it tasted like pickles later.
Exactly.
But you can make your own pickle
special
juice.
seasoning.
Yeah.
That's scriptural.
There you go.
Yeah.
We should have a whole sermon on pickling. There you go.
Burl it. Apply the heat.
Burl it.
That's
Burl
And
it.
then
You
you
burl
gotta
your
seal it.
cucumbers?
Huh?
You burl the whole thing? You boil the whole thing?
No.
You boil the juice.
Boil the juice.
You make your own
You
pickles?
skip that part because you just use someone else's.
Yeah, I skipped all that. Yeah, I cheated a little bit. But I still got pickles.
I think we just need to go to the bar and get pickled. As long as we don't drink the wine, it's okay.
But you know what goes amazing too, huh?
Depends on what idols are in there.
Once it becomes a pickle, it can never be a cucumber.
Yeah, you're right. That was a good point, Rustin. He just said, once a cucumber has become a pickle, it can never become a cucumber again.
Yeah. Because it's changed.
But you made a good point too. There's different ways of going about it. You can cheat, steal someone else's juice. No. I'm sitting here listening to Matt sermon. I had a conversation this week, and someone spat off this thing to me about, sex and pornography is wrong. I said, yeah. Well, what's the book and what's the verse? Well, I don't know. I just and it made me think about just this very generalized idea that we just go off of our perspective and we really don't check sometimes the sources that we run on. So you can steal someone else's juice in a sense versus you can go through the heat and you can season and marinate and you can pickle yourself.
Right. I like that. And that's one of the things that we talk about on a regular basis
That
is,
makes so much sense.
what do I tell you on a regular basis here, right? My job is to teach you what the text says. But I don't it doesn't end with me. Like, that's why we hand out these journals, right? Because what am I wanting you to do? I'm wanting you to dig. I want you to learn. And as I just said a minute ago, I want you to hear what is being said from these words.
And I think that something that a lot of times when, like you're saying, you can teach us the facts, but it's not for us to become theologians, but it's for us to begin to apply it. And the thing about it is, right, you do not become a pickle, right, unless you apply the cucumber to the juice and let it stay in it long enough till there's transformation. And and the thing about it is, right, and I thank God that we can sit here and laugh, right? But as a pastor, and you get to know enough people, and they have a loved one who's dying or just super sick, they don't know how to stand when the noise level is so loud in their ears, that, hey, they've got so many days and they're going to die. And I mean, those words will ring out to you. And if you don't know, and if you haven't trained yourself, right, to be able to separate the voices, right, from the voice of God or the truth of God or God, God's word, I mean, it can become detrimental to you. Because, I mean, when it's your kid, your loved one, the worst thing in the world is when you don't have control over it. You cannot get there. And I'm sorry, one of the first things, if you don't think you can hear from God, you absolutely know you can't hear from God when the doctor says, listen, we did all we can do, and in about 2 days they're going to die, so call your family, bring it in. And it does get serious. And I've watched my friend. I always called him a great man of faith, but then when they misdiagnosed him And when they finally figured it out, he had stage 4 cancer. He was in fear, and his family didn't even know how to pray. I mean, all they could do was just sit there and cry because they didn't train themselves. And though they went to church, but they didn't investigate it. They didn't get there and do those kind of, things that you spend that time to where you convince yourself, right? To where it's not Matt's belief. I would have left a long time ago from here, right? But Matt told me when we would sit down and talk to Rustin, I'm not asking you to believe like I believe. He goes, I'm going to give you the facts and the things I've learned for you to form your relationship with God and what you believe. And I'll let you know, that gave me freedom because he wasn't just trying to change my religion, He was trying to change my relationship with God, but it was for me to better me. And so that gave me this freedom and liberty, though, that we begin to have a more serious conversation. This fear left me. But I mean, I'll be honest with you. I mean, it's horrible to stand there with people, when they go in there, because that's not the time when they're at their best point to be able to learn. Because now, you know what they want, right? They want your juice with your seasoning. The time that you spent developing that recipe because they need it, because their loved one is going to die. But the whole other time that they didn't take that time to get to know God. I mean, I think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They knew God. Because what did they say? They said, listen, O king, we know God can do it. But even if he chooses not to, right? We're not gonna bow down to you. And I think that you get to know that because then what happens? They had the courage, right? It's what the outcome was. And I'm glad we can laugh about it. I'm not trying to make this all serious, but I mean it is a serious issue that we have with people in God. And I was big time. And until you come out of it, I know like when I talk to Walt's like Rustin, I never sat in the churches like you did. But now, because I'm learning different things, and maybe not even different things, but it's said like the Bible says it, not like somebody made a saying out of it, that I sit in the church, I'm like, that's a cliche. They're making these words up, and so what happens is, I don't process it. Why? I'm just going to believe because Matt said it's true, and that's it. And I don't get there and spend my time in the morning. I don't get there and meditate on it. I don't chew on it. And I don't question it for, quote, to believe it. To where when I believe that, I'm convinced. And, anyway, I just wanted to share that. Because it is something important, I think, I'm glad we can laugh right now.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Yeah, I think we'll end it there, but just with the idea of, I hope that we can get to a point where each and every one of us as a community is, as Paul said, being filled. And I feel like we're at a time in our life and as a community and just where we are. I think this is the time where we need to be digging in and we need to be listening as much as we can. This is a time where people are going to be coming to us, I feel, and asking questions. And we live in an era filled with fear. And I think when people are afraid, they need people who have character, who can speak into their lives, and who can be there to be a light in a place that fear feels nothing but darkness around us. So, may you continue to be being and be that light.